Okay, students, so we're looking at task 1, but I have also incorporated parts of task 2. I've just done this so that you can see both the parts of task 1 and task 2, and I'm also doing this as a Windows Form app, but I'll point out that there's a really very little change between a Windows Form app and a console app. First of all, way up here in the using statements up here, we have to add, of course, system I/O. It doesn't matter whether we are using a console app or a Windows Form app. It's absolutely necessary if we're going to do file handling to add the system I/O. So make sure you've done that. If you're having problems, especially, that is an absolute requirement, so you have to do that. Okay, so I did this as a form. Basically, I'm just doing it on form load. I'm not doing anything else. As far as my design, I pulled a list box over to this particular form, and that's the only component I have on here. The strings that we're using, we have to define line so that every time we go out to the file, we are reading in a single line. That's the same as it was, I think, on the handout. That's no big deal. Instead of calling my string array fruit, I called mine presidents for the task 1 item. No big surprise there. Now the try starts here before we do all of the file handling and ends at the end of all the file handling. So all of this that's in between is the stuff that we do. On task 1, we don't need the try catch, so all of this is basically unnecessary on task 1. But if you're doing task 2, just remember the try goes around all of the file handling, and then the catch is merely the message that you're doing. And instead of a message box show, you would use a write line, console write line, and then these messages. No big deal. So let's do the file handling first. Okay, so we have stream reader, and we have a variable named reader that is being passed a file name, in this case presidents.txt. Remember that presidents.txt has to be in bin/bin/debug. If it isn't there, then it won't be able to find it, and you're going to have problems there. So, if we were looking at the project, and the project, mine's on the desktop, and the WFA is just a Windows Form version of task 1. It has to be in there in bin debug, or it won't work. Now you could set a path, but you shouldn't set a path for a project for the school, because your path is going to be different, and so if you send it up to me, your path will not exist. Okay, so it won't work on my machine. Now we start the file loop here, and it reads in a line here. It says reader.readLine. That brings in a line into the variable line, and at the same time it checks to see whether it has null. If the line is not equal to null, then it's a good line. If it is equal to null, then it's the end of the file. Okay, then if it's the end of the file, then it drops out of the while loop, and that's the end of the using statement for the stream reader, and we're out of try, and out of try properly, which means it skips catch, and that's the end of the program. So it comes in here, we've read in one line, and we say presidents equals line.split, and it splits it on the commas. Okay, so the president's file is actually made up of only one line, which is all of the presidents separated by commas. Basically, it is a what we call a CSV file, but it's just named .text. Okay, CSV stands for comma separated values. Now, the next thing is we have a for each, and I say string s, which is just again a variable you should know pretty well by now. String s in presidents, which is this string array, okay, of presidents. Now s holds one president per time through the loop. Now I'm using a list box, as I said before, so lst names is my list box, and I do .items .add s, and what it does is it adds each name to the list box. If you are using the console version, which the assignment specifies, you simply say write line s, and it writes the name out. Okay, simple as that. Okay, so if you were using a console app, you'd simply say write line, well, you'd have to say console write line, of course. Console.writeLine and s. Okay, so it's not anything special there. That's just the way it is. Okay, so it would write that out, and it would go through the loop, and it would write, it would go through this for each loop, and it would write all of those out. If there were more lines with comma separated values, then it would read them in, split them into the array, and continue that particular process. If there was something wrong when the file opened, then it would generate an exception which would be caught by the catch statement, and I just specified the variable here for the exception and called it bad file name, and I write out the error message cannot find file, and then I say bad file name dot message, which writes out the exception message. Okay, so that's all that has to be done there. It doesn't have to be processed any other way. And if you were doing this again with the console, again, that's what the thing specified, so don't think that you have to do it different just because I was doing it different here. I'm just showing you how it would look. So, you would have your message cannot find file, and then this one would be the same way. You would have console write line open parentheses, and again, whatever file name that you used, or whatever variable rather that you used for your exception. Can't think and talk at the same time. Okay, so now I used bad file name. It doesn't really matter. Just remember that you oftentimes see the thing say exception E, but you can't use E because there's an E up here on my form load. If you don't have form load, like say for instance, if you're doing this as a console, it won't matter. But if you're doing this as a form, just remember you have to use a different variable than that one because this is all within here. When you run this, when I run this as a form, you'll see that the list box looks like this, and I've got all of my names in there. If you were to change this, now I know that a lot of people are saying, well, this doesn't seem to generate an error, an exception. All you have to do to test the exception is to take off the last letter of whichever file you're talking about. Take off the T off, the last T off of text, run it again, and you'll see the error messages come up. The first one was my first one, and then this is the exception message, and then of course my list box is empty. So if you're doing this in console, if you just take off that same letter there, I think it's capitals dot text, just take off the last T and then rerun it, and then it will generate an exception, and it will say, cannot find file, and whatever your exception thing is. If you're using e.message, it will show that. Okay, so nothing particularly hard about this. This is what it looks like on a form. I wanted to show it to you differently, but these are the only things that are right here are on the right hand side. On the bottom here are the only three things that are really different in for console. Okay, so have a good evening with that, and I will work on the database one shortly.